What did we learn during our study of Joshua? This is the question that we seek to answer today as we conclude our study of the book of Joshua on walking through the Bible. We have now come to the 60th and final lesson in our study of Joshua. If you have missed any episodes or would like to re-watch this series, you can find all of them at eastendchurch.org by searching under the media pull-down menu for the WTTB English podcast link. So having now completed our verse-by-verse study of Joshua, it is a good time to reflect on what we have learned. The book of Joshua begins right where the book of Deuteronomy left off. Moses has just died and Joshua is now the leader of Israel. The book begins with Israel in the plains of Moab, but quickly transitions to Israel traveling to the Jordan River where, like it was with the Red Sea, Israel would need God to perform a miracle in order for them to cross. And God did perform that miracle. But unlike when he parted the Red Sea, the miracle this time was that God stopped the Jordan River further upstream, allowing Israel to cross on dry land. Once Israel had crossed, they camped at Gilgal just outside Jericho, a place where the majority of them would remain for another 7 years. The army, however, would be responsible for actually defeating the peoples of Canaan. First up was Jericho. Jericho was a major city in Canaan surrounded by a large wall. That meant that it was well protected. It would therefore take God being with them in order for Israel to take such a great city. And of course, God was with Israel. But unlike other battles that took place throughout Canaan, the Battle of Jericho would begin by God performing a miracle in order to show Israel his power, and it would be by his help that they would defeat the Canaanites. After 6 days of once marching quietly around the city, on that 7th day Israel marched around the city 7 times, then shouted with a great shout, and the walls of Jericho fell, allowing Israel to defeat the city rather easily. Only Rahab and her family, who obeyed the words of the spies given before the battle, survived. From Jericho, Israel's army was to move west to Ai, a city considerably smaller than Jericho. But unlike with Jericho, Israel was defeated at Ai. Why? Because God was not with them due to Achan taking some of the bounty from Jericho, something that God had expressly forbidden when Israel took that city. Once Achan was dealt with, though, Israel defeated Ai through the power of God. Jericho and Ai were really in the middle of Canaan, west of the Jordan, separating the plains and the mountains that would become Judah in the south, and the mountains of what would become Ephraim in the north. Israel's first focus after Ai was to turn south. Before moving south, though, they were tricked into making a peace covenant with the people of Gibeon. The reason they were tricked was because they didn't consult God, a weakness in Israel that would pose consistent problems in their history. Forced to honor this treaty, Israel was forced to defend Gibeon against attack from kings of the south, a battle that Israel won completely with the Lord's help. Once these 5 kings were defeated, Israel proceeded to conquer southern Canaan, though it did not destroy all the peoples of the land, something that God did say would happen in Deuteronomy. However, the problem that would come in the future is that Israel stopped removing the Canaanites from the land and actually intermarried with them, which caused God to decide to keep those remaining peoples in the land to torment Israel for their disobedience. With the south of Canaan under Israel's control, Israel's army moved north. The peoples of the north, led by the king of Hatzor, attacked Israel, but were utterly defeated. Hatzor was eventually burned down, and the north was subdued. But like with southern Canaan, there were Canaanites left in northern Canaan as well that Israel failed to remove. The book of Judges will show us the consequences of that decision. With the land now under their control, it was time to divide it up. 2.5 tribes, Reuben, Gad, and the half-tribe of Manasseh, inherited land east of the Jordan, as we saw in the book of Numbers. West of the Jordan, the tribes of Judah, Dan, Simeon, and Benjamin inherited land south of the mountains of Ephraim, while Ephraim, the other half-tribe of Manasseh, Asher, Zebulun, Issachar, and Naphtali inherited land to the north of the mountains of Ephraim. Caleb, one of the 2 righteous spies in the book of Numbers, inherited Hebron in Judah, and Joshua inherited Timnath-Serah in the tribe of Ephraim. The Levites were also given 48 cities spread throughout Israel where they could live, though they received no inheritance. The book of Joshua ended with the death of Joshua and Eleazar the high priest, setting up the narrative for the book of Judges. As for the book itself, Joshua 24:26 made it quite clear that Joshua was the writer of most of this book through the inspiration of the Holy Spirit. There were parts, such as the ending, which had to be written later by another author, but the majority of the narrative was written by the one who actually experienced it, pointing us to Joshua, the main character of the book. That means that most of the book would have been originally written around 1375 BC. What lessons can we learn from this book? Well, the first lesson we're confronted with is that God hates sin. The Canaanites were dispossessed of their land not because God hates Canaanites as a people, but because the Canaanites worshipped other gods and thus lived in sin. Had the Canaanites worshipped him, the God of heaven, and been faithful to him, Israel wouldn't have been told to dispossess the Canaanites of their land, but would have been given another land. Even Israel wasn't immune from God's judgment. When Achan sinned, Israel lost a Ai. When Israel didn't remove all the peoples from the land, God punished Israel by letting these nations be a thorn in their side. When it comes to sin, God is not a respecter of persons. God rewards the righteous who are saved by grace through faith and punishes the wicked who are not. We need to remember that lesson today. The other lesson we can learn is that God is faithful to keep his promises. God promised Abraham the land of Canaan, but only when the sins of the Amorites were full. About 600 years had passed, but by the days of Joshua, the sins of the Amorites were full, and God gave Israel the land. Because God was faithful numerous times throughout the book, God told Joshua and Israel to be strong and courageous and not be afraid, for the Lord was with them. Today, God has not promised us physical success in all that we do. But if God is with us, we can withstand the trials of the devil, for God has promised us a way of escape from temptation, so that we can bear it. Let's then be strong and courageous and not be afraid, for the Lord is with us. And if the Lord is with us, who can be against us? With that, then, we conclude our study of the book of Joshua. We're going to continue on in the Old Testament, so the Lord willing, in the next lesson, we will be beginning our study of the book of Judges with an introduction to that book. We hope you'll join us for that discussion as we continue our walk through the Bible, one verse at a time. Thank you for watching today's episode. We hope that you found it edifying and ask that you not only subscribe to our channel and podcast, but that you like and share this episode among your friends, so that the saving gospel of Jesus Christ can go out to the whole world.